Chapter 9. The Anarchy. With Joshua dead and the nation dispersed into tribal states, the people lacked a focused leader. It was left to the individual to do as he saw fit with his inheritance. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were shadowy figures buried in half a millennium of history. Moses was long gone, and even Joshua was a fading memory. So to Israel, this was a new era in a strange culture. Fascinating expressions of faith were evident everywhere they looked. These objects of worship were solid and tangible. They looked good on the shelf, first as ornaments, then as talismans, which, when believed, became expressions of faith, petitions in tough times, and praise when life was good. And the local people were interesting. The girls were sexy, and the guys were hunks, and before you could say, "Who's your father?" the purity of the family bloodline was contaminated, and mixed-race marriages confused the identity of who should be honored as God. God was not pleased, and trouble multiplied. But whenever things got rough, a memory would stir, and the Israelis would cry out to the God about whom their grandparents had told them, the Lord who had delivered them from the Egyptians way back in the last century. Then the Lord would be sorry for them, for he hated to see them suffer. His solution was always the same. He would raise up a man who would lead them, a deliverer. Judges, these leaders were termed. Othniel was the first. Caleb, the aged spy, had taught him well, challenging his nephew to defeat the giants in Debir. Othniel called Israel to arms and defeated the king of Aram, who had been making life a misery. But as predictable as taxes, the next generation was back to their old ways, and trouble followed, this time in the form of the Moabites. King Eglon led his force across the Jordan and captured what had been Israel's first prize, Jericho. From there he harassed the Israelis, imposing punitive taxes on all who wanted to stay alive. For 18 years, Eglon grew fat at Israel's expense. Then one year at tax time, Ehud, a left-handed man from the tribe of Benjamin, led a delegation to deliver the tax money to Eglon at his palace in Jericho. Security searched Ehud for weapons, but missed the dagger he had concealed where a right-handed man would not expect it to be. When the money was delivered into Eglon's greedy hands, Ehud whispered, "I have a secret message from God for you, for your ears only." Intrigued, Eglon dismissed his servants. As soon as they were alone, Ehud pulled out his concealed weapon and plunged it into Eglon's vast stomach, where it disappeared, enveloped in years of greed. Quick as a flash, Ehud locked the door and made his escape down the latrine and out through the sewage system. By the time the king's servants had found a spare key and plucked up the courage to interrupt what they had taken to be Eglon's private time in the washroom, Ehud was long gone and was raising an army to kick the Moabites out back across the Jordan where they belong. Peace at last. 80 years of peace, enforced by a judge named Shamgar. But as soon as that generation was dead, history repeated itself, and once again Israel's misconduct led to their downfall. This time their tormentor was Jabin, a Canaanite king in the north, whose army was commanded by Sisera. Sisera was a ruthless cavalryman who boasted 900 state-of-the-art iron chariots. For 20 years, life was misery for the wretched Israelis. Then they remembered to pray. Honest leaders were in short supply in those days, but the brightest light around was a woman named Deborah. To her people would come, to air their grievances and to seek her wisdom under a palm tree on a hilltop near Bethel. Clearly something had to be done about Jabin, and since male initiative was lacking, Deborah took it upon herself to commission a man to take action. "Barak, the Lord commands you to raise an army of 10,000, march them to the top of Mount Tabor." sounded doable, but Barak needed reassurance. I'll only go if you'll come with me, Deborah. Very well, but since you've requested a woman to hold your hand, to a woman will go the credit for the victory. Sisera and his armoured divisions massed in the plain at the foot of Mount Tabor, while Barak looked down from his lofty vantage point. The mountain was impossible terrain for Sisera's chariots, while the plain was ideal. So long as he stayed on the mountain, Barak would be safe, but to descend to the plain would be suicide. When he hesitated, Deborah urged him, "Go on! Today the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hands." Why, it sure didn't look promising, but how could he refuse a woman? Perhaps the rainy season was Barak's salvation, and perhaps the flat ground was too soft for chariot wheels, but for whatever reason, Sisera abandoned his ride to flee on foot through the mud. He ran till he was utterly spent. Then he noticed a settlement of nomads, with a woman crouching in a tent door. "Come in, my lord," she beckoned. "Don't be afraid." "Spare me a drink," Sisera panted. "Don't let anyone know I'm in here." Exhaustion overcame the defeated general, who sank into a deep sleep. The woman quietly took a hammer and spike and nailed his head to the floor. He never woke up. Legends and ballads are made of such heroism, and a song was written in celebration of the event. Next, it was the turn of the Midianites to chastise Israel. These fierce desert people swarmed up from the south and east, and for years made it their business to impoverish the land, stealing livestock and destroying crops. They were led by two ruthless warlords, Zebah and Zalmunna. Israel begged the Lord for help. Gideon was little more than a boy when these two thugs came to the family farm in Ophrah. He saw the glint of sadism in their eyes as they hacked a couple of his brothers to death. The memory haunted him into adult life, so little wonder that when he was called to be the next judge, Gideon was hiding in a winepress, secretly threshing wheat for fear the Midianites might put him to a similar fate. He glanced up to ensure that he was alone, and to his horror he saw someone sitting just a few feet away, leaning against a tree, gazing nonchalantly into the distance. "God be with you, mighty warrior," the stranger said without getting up. "Nice thought," Gideon retorted. "But what good would that do? Seems he's lost his touch. Whatever happened to the good old days when he rescued Israel from Egyptian slavery, eh? Now he's abandoned us to Midianite supremacy." The stranger turned and looked Gideon in the eyes. "So go and do something about it. Save Israel from Midian. I am sending you." "Me? Save Israel? Dream on, I'm a nobody." "But I will be with you, so you can't lose." Gideon invited the strangers to stay for a meal, but when he laid the food out on the rock, fire flared up and consumed the food as though it were an offering. When Gideon swung round to look at the stranger, he'd vanished. "I'm a dead man. I've seen an angel." To save Israel was a grand ideal, but where should he start? "Start at home," came the answer that same evening. "Clean house, get rid of all trace of idolatry." So that night, Gideon hacked down the family idol and demolished its altar. He rebuilt a new altar to the Lord, and then went to the barn and slaughtered his father's best bull, which he sacrificed to the Lord. Next morning there was trouble. "Whoever's responsible for this desecration must die," community leaders demanded. "If Baal is a real god, he can defend his own honor without your help," Joash, Gideon's father, responded, jumping in to rescue his son. Further argument was eclipsed by the news that the Midianites were advancing. At that moment the Spirit of God came on Gideon. He blew a call to arms on a ram's horn, and to his amazement thousands responded. Gideon was terrified. He couldn't sleep that night, So kneeling beside his bed, he prayed, God, I need a sign that you really are with me. Nothing dramatic. How about this fleece that I'm kneeling on being soaked with dew in the morning, and all the ground around it bone dry? In the morning, he jumped out of bed, and squelch, the fleece was soaking. One more step coated his now wet feet with dry dust. But perhaps this was a natural phenomenon. Other way round tomorrow, God. Dry fleece, wet ground. Then I'll know it's you, okay? Next day, his bleary feet hit a warm, dry fleece, but his next step sank up to his ankles in mud. There being no further combinations of wet and dry, Gideon was forced to concede that God really was with him. But so that you'll be quite clear that it's simply because I am with you that you have the victory, reduce the size of your army, God instructed him. Gideon announced that anyone who was afraid was free to go home. And since they were already hopelessly outnumbered by Midianites, it was no surprise that 2/3 of the volunteers upped sticks and left. Gideon must have been tempted to leave with them, but he stayed, along with 10,000 others. Still too many, said God. Take them to the river for a drink. 9,700 sank their faces in the water to drink, oblivious of the proximity of hostile troops. 300 lifted the water to their vigilant faces and drank from cupped hands. They were the chosen ones. So there they were, just 300, bivouacked in the hills, and a menacing horde of enemy marauders in the valley below. Another sleepless night. God encouraged Gideon. Go down and attack. But if you're afraid to go down, then just do it. Go down. Then you'll find the courage that you need to go down. So he went down. Great cure for the faint of heart. He crept into the camp and heard a conversation between two Midianites. One was recounting to the other a nightmare that had just woken him. Apparently he dreamt that a loaf of bread had rolled down the hill and knocked over his tent. "It's an omen!" his friend cried. "We are finished!" "Get up!" yelled Gideon when he got back to the camp. "God has given them to us on a plate." His plan could hardly be called a plan of attack. He spread his men around the Midianites in 3 companies, each man armed only with a bugle and flaming torch hidden under a clay pitcher. Then, on his command, they all smashed the pitchers and blew the bugles and shouted, "The sword of the Lord and Gideon!" And the sound of smashing jars, yelling men, blaring bugles, woke the sleeping Midianites. As they stumbled out of their tents, the hills were full of lights and war cries. In the darkness it was impossible to tell friend from foe, but since all their foes were in reality safe in the hills, they set to slaughtering one another. Survivors fled for their lives. The 300 gave chase and were soon joined by thousands of other willing volunteers who slaughtered stragglers all the way to the Jordan River. But it was the original 300 who pursued the survivors deep into enemy territory. They finally caught up with the Midianite warlords, Zebah and Zalmunna, still in command of a not inconsiderable army of 15,000. Thinking that they were safe, they were less vigilant than prudence should have demanded. Without a moment's hesitation, Gideon attacked. The slaughter was complete, with the bonus of capturing the 2 leaders alive. "You recall years ago when you came to a farm in Oprah near Tabor?" Gideon asked them. An evil look came over their faces. "Yes, and we've got down to size some of those arrogant young weasels who live there." "Those were my brothers." Gideon took a sword and ended years of sleepless nights and fear-filled dreams. But Gideon's resentment was not the success it perhaps could have been. The plunder from the battle made him a rich man, but riches can be a curse if misused, and even worse if worshipped. He married several wives and sired 70 sons, plus one illegitimate kid, Abimelech. threw a flutter on the side with a young servant girl. Abimelech was a mistake right from the start. Soon as Gideon was dead, he murdered his 70 brothers and set himself up as king. What popularity he may initially have enjoyed was short-lived. Civil unrest grew to rebellion, till finally Abimelech and his band of thugs forced thousands of his fellow citizens to take refuge in the temple that they'd built to honor Baal. Abimelech simply burned it down over their heads, a fail-safe way to crush opposition. He might have extended his reign of terror further had not a woman thrown a rock over the wall and cracked his